Hello! In this Unity tutorial, we're going to continue talking about the Unity UI, or User Interface for short. Previously, we talked about the canvas, as the canvas being the top-level parent for all UI elements to exist on. An example of a UI element is text, images, other types of graphics, and videos. In this video specifically, we're going to be taking a look at UI images and how to add them to your canvas. So to get started, I went ahead and created a new 2D Unity project. If you don't know how to do this, please revisit the project setup video for further help. So to get started, let's go ahead and create the UI image. So last time, when we learned about the canvas, we went up to the upper left-hand corner, selected Game Object. From the drop-down menu, we selected UI, and then we went to Canvas. Before you click on Canvas, this time let's go ahead and select Image. When you clicked Image, you'll notice a few things happened. In the hierarchy on the left side of your screen, 3 new things were created. First, Unity saw that you didn't have a canvas, so it went ahead and created a canvas for you, as all UI elements need to exist on a canvas. Then, it created the image as a child of that canvas. If we were to create another image, so let's go ahead and do that real quick. Game Object, UI, Image. You'll notice that it's not going to create a second canvas, as you already have one in there. For the purposes of this video, we're just going to stick with one image for now. Let's go ahead and select on it, press the delete key on your keyboard to delete that out of there. The final thing that it created was the event system. The event system is a necessary component for the Unity user interface to be able to receive input from the user, such as mouse clicks on buttons. If you notice that your Unity UI is not responding to user input, one of the first things that you should check for is to make sure that you have an event system in your hierarchy. If not, you can find that under Game Object, UI, Event System. We already have one, so let's not add a second one. In our previous tutorial, we learned about the canvas, but we're going to go ahead and revisit some of the important properties of the canvas, and this is something you should do every time before you start working with a Unity UI. Go ahead and select on the canvas in the hierarchy, and notice the values of this canvas are going to appear in the inspector on the right side of your screen. The two most important things that we want to focus on are the canvas and the canvas scaler components. We're going to leave it as the screen space overlay, which means we have the main camera right here, and we're going to put all of the content that we want our camera to see inside of this window and around it. But we have our UI, our user interface, is going to be overlaying on top of all of the elements. So it's possible that part of the UI may obscure some of the elements in there. An example of this would be if you had like a health bar or a mini-map from some video games that you've played. You know that they overlay part of the game, and that's what this is mimicking. The most important thing though that we need to change is the canvas scaler. If you have it set currently by default constant pixel size, irrespective if you're on a low resolution such as 800 by 600 or if you're on a high resolution like a 4K monitor, it's going to be the same size no matter what, which means on a really low resolution it's going to be very big, on a very high resolution it's going to be very small. So we're going to go ahead and select Scale with Screen Size because we want our UI elements to scale, and we're going to put in a reference resolution. I typically like to put in here 1920 by 1080, a standard 1080p resolution. And we're going to go ahead and leave the defaults here, screen match mode with the match width and height, matching the width first. And if we zoom out here with your mouse wheel, let's go ahead and take a look here. We previously talked in our Canvas video the distinction between these two windows, but as a small recap, this is your entire canvas, and this is your smaller actual main camera where all the content's going to go. You'll notice, for example, if I were to take, by clicking on this image and dragging it down here, even though it's covering everything inside that camera, you're not actually going to see anything over here. It has to be up in this large box in order for us to be able to see it in the actual game view. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the image now. So first, let's actually get an image inside here. And I downloaded two images, the CMU logo and a CMU background. You'll want to make sure that they're set up correctly. If you are using a later version, Unity 2019 or later, they should automatically be converted to Sprite, Sprite 2D and UI. If they're not, click on the image that you brought in and change the texture type from default to Sprite 2D and UI, and then click the Apply button below. And then they're going to be all set for you to go ahead and use on your user interface. One of the most important things that you also need to get into the habit of is naming your stuff. Leaving things like main camera and canvas, for the most part, are perfectly fine. The main camera, there should only ever be one of those in the scene, but you may have multiple canvases in the scene. So it is important to make sure that you rename your canvases and all respective children UI elements. For this video, we're just going to have one canvas. In a later video, there's going to be an example of a file menu system that's going to have multiple canvases. Please take a look at that on how to organize those. In this video though, let's go ahead and rename this image. We're going to call this one logo. Now to rename something very quickly inside of Unity, go ahead and press the F2 function key on your keyboard. Again, F2 will go ahead and rename anything. You could also single click on it once and it will automatically prompt you to rename it. Okay, so now that we have it renamed properly, let's go ahead and position it. If we select on it, if you're not seeing the blue corner outline, make sure that you have the rect tool selected, and then you should be able to left click on this image as long as you're in scene view. If you're a little bit too far out, it may be hard to click on it. Just make sure that you're zoomed in enough that you can see it. And then you'll see the properties of this in the inspector on the right hand side of your screen. Notice we have these position values here. We're not particularly concerned with Z at the moment. As we're dealing with a 2D surface, just the X and Y will be sufficient. Let's go ahead and just zero these out really quick. Perfect. Alright, so now we have this in the center of our screen. I'm going to go ahead and drag this window over just so we can have the most screen space possible. Perfect. What's really helpful too is to be able to side by side the scene and game window, so that's what I'm going to do by click holding and dragging on the game tab and creating this separate side by side window structure. And what that's going to be allow me to do is just to be able to see any changes that I make in my scene. I want to be able to see what the user is going to be able to see. So I don't want to stare at a white box, so let's actually go ahead and get that first image in there. Again, this could be anything. I'm going to use the CMU logo. Let's go ahead, click, hold, drag. Make sure you have the logo selected here in the hierarchy. Click, hold, drag this into the source image slot. Another way to do it is you can click this little target or circle here, and you'll be able to search through all of the images that you have available to you, and you can select on that image respectively. Let's go ahead and talk about some canvas properties again real quick. With the canvas selected, remember that we set the UI scale mode to scale with screen size. We also set the reference resolution at 1920 by 1080. It's going to be really helpful for you to be able to see what that's actually going to look like. In the Game View tab, you can actually change the aspect ratio by dropping down this free aspect menu and selecting 2K. If you don't have 2K available to you, no problem. Go ahead and click the Add New Item Plus icon. Here you can give it a name and then go ahead and enter the 1920 by 1080 in the width and height respectively and click OK. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and click on the 2K. You can see now how we have these gray borders on the side. This is showing you what it would look like on a 1920 by 1080p resolution monitor. Alright, so now let's talk a little bit about the positioning of this stuff. So if we were to side by side the game view and the scene view, let me make a little bit more room here. We have it working very nicely with the 1920 by 1080 resolution. If we go ahead and actually move this around, you can see that it's going to stay in the center of this pretty nicely. As well as, if we go ahead and do something like moving it to the bottom, and to move it to the bottom, we'll go ahead and select on the image in the hierarchy, And then what we'll do is we're actually going to snap it to the bottom. So let's talk now about the rect transform. If you open up this target cursor icon, it'll bring down the anchor presets, and you're going to go ahead and select on this one in the bottom center here. Go ahead and hold down Shift and Alt at the same time. So hold down Shift and Alt and then go ahead and click. You're going to notice that's going to snap that image to the bottom. Now a few things have happened and we're going to break those down. The very first thing is these are anchor presets. So what is an anchor? Well, an anchor is simply a way or a predefined way to determine how your UI elements are going to scale when the aspect ratio changes. So what we say in Unity is we're anchoring this UI element to a position. So for example, we just anchored this UI element to the bottom of the screen, and the anchor icons are actually these 4 white triangles here in our scene view. Currently they're all collapsed in on each other, and they're in the bottom center. What that means is this Flying C logo is going to be fixed to this position, and it's going to scale relative to this position when the aspect ratio changes. When we say aspect ratio changing, we can go ahead and actually click on this and change the aspect ratio to see what that would look like. So we're on a 2K monitor. Let's go ahead and drop down to a lower resolution, maybe the standard 1024 by 768. You'll notice that when we change that resolution, it changed it quite a bit. It's a lot skinnier now, but you'll notice that that C is actually staying on the bottom regardless of how this is going to be scaled, which is very nice. If we change this to free aspect, for example, you'll notice that it's also going to stay right in the bottom center with no problem. Now the anchor presets are very important. The reason being is I'm going to show you an example where this is not going to work out very well. We currently again have it anchored to the bottom center, and we have it positioned relative to that anchor in the bottom center. Let's go ahead and click on this Rect Transform preset again and hold Shift and Alt. Hold down Shift and Alt and go ahead and select the center, and we're just going to reposition that in the center. Now let's go ahead and zoom a little bit in on the scene view, and you notice that our anchor preset is now directly in the center. It is important to note that the position X, position Y is relative to where this is with the anchor, where the UI element is with the anchor. So for example, if we go ahead and move this, you'll notice that my position X, my position Y are changing. They're changing relative to that anchor position. So if we were to move this down here, notice that the anchor is still in the center of the scene, but this is now down here in the lower left-hand corner. What happens if we change the screen size? So you'll notice that it's actually behaving not quite how we want. When the aspect ratio, we're currently in free aspect. When the aspect ratio shrinks, it's actually moving a little bit more towards the center. This would be a more appropriate layout for maybe a phone or something like that. But then if we make the aspect ratio a little bit too long, you'll notice that it actually even goes outside of it and below it, so it's actually cutting this UI element off, and that's definitely not what we want. The reason why it's doing this is because if we take a look at the canvas settings here, this is where this important screen match mode is coming into place here. We currently have it on match width or height, and we're currently matching the width first. So there's more weight on the width than there is with the height. If you want to see kind of how this is going to change it, you can go ahead and drag this scale. You'll notice that the image is already moving. And now, when we change it just like this, rather than moving up with it, it's actually just moving side to side. So if we had a really small aspect ratio like a phone, well, this UI is not going to be very nice at all because it's actually completely cutting this out. That's definitely not what we want. And it's because we have our anchor set incorrectly. Something that we'd want to likely do is set up our anchors in a slightly different way. One way that you can do it is to go ahead and position it as close to the location of where it is. So for example, if we were to take this anchor position and per se. You can either manually move it by clicking on each of these and dragging. So notice I click and hold. You select back on there, drag them down to that corner. Now this is going to move with respect to this corner. So what this is essentially saying is, by putting the anchor in this lower left-hand corner, when the aspect ratio changes, aka the screen size changes, it's going to move relative to this corner. Previously, when it was in the center, the image was in the same location, but it was moving with respect to that position in the center, which is why it was getting cut off. Now we have it here at the bottom. It's going to stay roughly in the same place. You'll notice that as you move this anchoring position around, it's going to change how this is going to respond when the UI is changed respectively. So what we can also do is, for example, we can change this to actually encompass the entire screen. So if we were to do something a little bit more like this, that's going to be a little bit better. Now what this is actually going to do is actually stretch your UI elements so that as your screen size changes, it's also going to rescale the UI elements. Now you can see that this is a little bit finicky. Let's go ahead and actually scale this up a little bit. So we have our 2K resolution here. Now this is not going to work well for smaller type of images like this logo here. It will rescale appropriately, nicely, as long as it's bigger, as I just showed you. If it's smaller, you'll notice that it's going to stretch pretty hard. This is really more applicable to when you're working with a background image, so let me actually go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this one out of here, and I'm going to go ahead and just go through the process of creating another UI image, and this one is going to be our background image. So with the background image, what I'd like to do is I'm just going to go ahead and start by positioning it in the upper left-hand corner, and I'm going to go ahead and use the rect tool and stretch it out just like that. So it looks really nice in the 2K resolution. It's going to scale for the most part. What happens if we go to free aspect? Okay. Well, there's an issue right there. Notice that when our width of our aspect gets a little bit too wide, notice that it is becoming too short, so we see the blue background of the camera. We definitely don't want that. The reason why that's happening is because we don't have our anchors set correctly. It is scaling relative to the center of the camera, but what we want to do is confine it to the camera area. So this is a really good practice if you want your UI to work on any size background with a free aspect. We can go ahead and use the predefined anchor points. Let me go ahead and place them in the corners respectively. So when I'm finished, we'll have the anchors in all four corners just like that. Then let's go ahead and with our image, we want to resize it correctly here. So I'm going to go ahead and use the rect transform tool here and just get that up in the center just like that. Perfect. Let's actually go ahead and put a background in so we're not staring at this white background. I'm going to go ahead and use my CMU background just like that. Awesome. And remember, let's always get into the habit of renaming our stuff, so I'm going to press F2 on this in the hierarchy and go ahead and rename this to background image, just so I know what it is. Especially once your UIs get quite cluttered, it becomes very difficult to find things in the hierarchy. Please take it from my experience. Alright, so now let's take a look at what this is going to do. So now when we change our aspect ratio, you notice that this background is going to stretch really nicely irrespective of what resolution we're on. You can see how it's going to look in different size resolutions. So there's our 1920 by 1080. There's a smaller resolution. You can just flip through them just to make sure that it looks like what you want. And then we could come back in here and let's go ahead and add one more image, UI and image, and then we'll go ahead and actually position this image down in the bottom center. So we can go ahead and click here again, hold down Shift and Alt. Now Shift and Alt, you can see here, is setting the pivot and the position, and I do need to talk about the pivot. Let's go ahead and set this first in the bottom center. I should have made it a little bit bigger first. That's not really a big issue though. I wanted to make this something like 250 by 200. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And it's actually on the bottom very nicely. So let's go ahead now and add the logo. Perfect. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the move tool, and I just wanted to move it up just a little bit. So now that's going to scale really nicely with that, irrespective of what aspect ratio we are on. So it looks great. Okay, let me talk about the pivot now. So we talked about the anchoring system. We talked about how to add images. The last thing we need to talk about is the pivoting system. So with the rect tool enabled, you'll be able to see the pivot. Now the pivot is going to be this circle here. You can see the coordinates for the pivot in the inspector right here. Currently it's at 0.50. Notice if we were to change that to like 0, for example, it's going to go over here to this corner here. You can put in values here, and you can see how the pivot is going to change. 0.5 is going to put it directly in the center. 1 will put it up in this upper right hand corner. The pivot is respectively how it's going to be transformed. So for example, when we use like the rotation tool and we rotate it, it's going to rotate based on that pivot. If we were to move the pivot though, so let's say we put the pivot at 0, 0, it's now going to rotate relative to where that pivot location actually is. Alright, and you can change where the pivot is. If you take a look up next to your transform tools, there's the pivot in the center. So this is if you just want to immediately get to the center of the object, that's very handy, but also keep your pivot location in the same spot. That'll work very nicely. I'm going to go ahead and Control Z that. But the pivot is essentially just where you want those transform manipulations to be applied to the object. Alright, so that about does it for this image-based tutorial. Takeaways from this tutorial: when you create the image, or when you create a UI element, if you don't have a canvas, it's automatically going to create the canvas for you. Don't delete the event system because that's used for user input, and we'll talk about that in a later video. In addition, make sure to just change your canvas scaler to scale with screen size and put a reference resolution that you're most commonly going to build for. So for example, a 1920 by 1080. And I would recommend leaving this on width, just like that, but height is just fine. This is just going to be what it's going to scale to first. So if you are having on width, it's going to match up the width first before it matches up the height. Vice versa, it's going to match the height before it matches the width. And that's just a personal preference. You can put it in halfway at 0.5 if you want it to try and do its best to estimate equally on both sides. And then as far as the image properties goes, we talked about what the pivot is, we talked about the anchoring system and how it is used when the aspect ratio changes, how it's going to scale that system. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comment section below or reach out to your instructor. They'll be more than happy to help you. Thank you very much.